So you see, there's a bunch of ways to go second in Yu-Gi-Oh! But more often than not, the easy solution is either to play hand traps or board breakers. I want to say at the current moment, hand traps might be a little better than board breakers. And I'll explain that while I cover the top 10 best hand traps of the current format. But before we proceed, I'd really appreciate it if you could just smash the like and subscribe button for me real quick. You're the best, thank you so much, and now let's get right into it. So the number 10 spot goes to Watt Kinetic Puppeteer. Just kidding, that card is utter garbage. Alright, seriously, I would give that spot to Nibiru. I'm not a really big fan of this card because honestly a lot of decks inherently play around Nibiru. Like the Chimera deck already does so much using only 4 summons, so even if they try, they don't really lose that hard to Nibiru. The Kishtira deck loses to Nibiru if it gets greedy, but it could just summon a Rizard in only 4 summons. And the Purely deck is summoning Expurely Noir on your own turn, and they're not really spamming the board on turn 1. And honestly, Nibiru is not really worth main decking when Labyrinth is still around in the format. I think Nibiru varies anywhere between unplayable to decent. It can be unplayable when you can't resolve it because your opponent didn't summon 5 times or more in one turn, obviously. And again, it's usually decent when it works, or it can be high impact against players who carelessly run into it. But to be fair, the high impact only really comes up in game 1 when the surprise factor is a thing. Because Nibiru is not really gonna work 2 times in a row against the same player. Unless the deck itself loses to Nibiru, like Salamangreat for example. But then again, in my eyes at least, Nibiru doesn't have enough applications to warrant it being a main deck card, which is why it's so low on the list. Anyways, number 9 is DD Crow, which is a really interesting one. So the card is simultaneously better and worse than the Bestial Monsters for a few reasons. You can banish any kind of monsters with DD Crow, so not just light or dark monsters. But most importantly, you can banish spells and traps, which is really relevant against Purely, because if they go Purely Lily in order to target something in the grave, you can banish it with DD Crow, and that way they can't really Xyz summon. So in that instance, DD Crow can even be better than Valor or Infinite Impermanence, because if your opponent has the Purely Field spell, at least you're playing around it. But to be fair, outside of these niche applications, DD Crow is usually not too great. It varies from mediocre to mid, unlike the Bestials, which can actually be really, really good. Speaking of which, number 8 on the list are the Bestial Monsters. Given the fact that I kinda just talked about them and DD Crow, which are really similar, it's not really like I have to explain much now. But I do believe that the Bestial Monsters have a reason to exist in the current metagame because they're really good against light and dark decks. And even if your opponent doesn't really play any light and dark monsters, if you are playing Dragon Link or Despia, at least you can banish your own cards and do something with the Bestials. Because Magnamut is really cracked. And Saronir is good in the branded deck because you can send your branded spells and traps and actually get some advantage with them. But I wouldn't really recommend main decking the Bestial Monsters in other decks, most of the time at least. Now number 7 is a card that I used to play so much higher on the list, but I don't really like it anymore. I am talking about Ghostbel, which in a way is kind of similar to DD Crow and the Bestial Monsters. The difference is that instead of banishing something in the graveyard, you're rather negating something that interacts with or from the graveyard. So in other words, Ghostbel excels against cards like Big Welcome Labyrinth, Mathmech Super Factorial, and Shabrigade Revolt. My issue with Ghostbel is that outside of these applications, it's not really good. And honestly, it is losing relevance because Labyrinth is seeing less and less play. And to be fair, Ghostbel is a complete garbage against the newer decks. And by the way, I am speaking out of experience here. You know, I played a couple of events recently, and honestly, I don't think I've ever had to cite Ghostbel once. And when I was citing it in, it was just out of, I have nothing against that deck, rather than that card is good against them. But even though I just talked a lot of smack about the card, I still believe that it's really good against the decks it's supposed to be played against. But still, due to its low relevance and applicability, I would still only give it like a 5 out of 10. So in other words, it's kind of like average, not amazing, and not bad. Number 6 is a hand trap that I consider to be the worst out of its trio family. I'm talking about Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, aka the extra copies of Valor and Infinite Impermanence. I'm not gonna beat around the bush or cap here. This card is only really played if you already have 3 Valor and 3 Imperm in your deck, and you're looking for extra hand traps. Because of the stupid difference between the TCG and the OCG, you can't really negate a trigger effect of a monster special summoned on your own turn with Ghost Mourner. Because you have turn player priority on your own turn, so you have to use your trigger effects first, and then your opponent activates them in Chainlink 2, which means that they will resolve before your Mourner. And that is absolutely pathetic. But in the OCG, if your opponent summons Guardian Chimera on your own turn, you can actually negate it with your Mourner. I guess you could still use Mourner to negate like a Winda that's being summoned on your own turn, or like a Fenrir off of Shangri-La, but that's just kind of irrelevant. I've seen better, I'm used to better, and so are you. Oh, and honestly, burning your opponent in time is irrelevant. Don't try to rely on that. Number 5 is Valor, and yet again, I'm not here to waste your time or sugarcoat anything. The card does stop normal summon monsters, and it is not once per turn, which is really good. The drawback though is that you cannot use it under Shifter because it's not like a you can discard this card, you rather have to send it from the hand to the graveyard in order to use its effect. And it's only utilizable on the main phase, so if your opponent can special summon a monster on the draw phase to also play around Drool, then you're screwed. So yeah, like a Kitty on draw phase with a quick play or Branded Opening into a Luber, and your Valor just doesn't really do anything. But I want to say outside of that, Valor is usually better than Ghost Mourner. Alright, number 4 is a really interesting one because it is one of the best hand traps that you're usually not going to be main decking. The card is infinitely better now than it was before, and I am talking about Retaliating C. It's a level 4 monster that special summons itself to your field whenever your opponent activates a spell card that tries to special summon a monster. And while it is on the field, it pretty much acts like a macrocosmos. Now, I just want to make it crystal clear that this card only works on spell cards that include an effect to special summon a monster. So, for example, if my opponent activates Zodiac Barrage, I cannot use Retaliating C here. The activation of Zodiac Barrage isn't trying to special summon a monster, so Retaliating C is dead. And when my opponent uses the effect of Zodiac Barrage to try to special summon a monster, my opponent is using a spell effect and not activating a spell card. That's not the same thing. So Retaliating C is typically dead against continuous spells that try to special summon a monster as part of their effects, but it's usually good against like normal spells or, quick play spell cards. So whether we're talking about Purely or Chimera or Branded or Runic, it's really, really good. And it's also unaffected by Call by the Grave and Crossout Designator unless your opponent is randomly citing in one Retaliating C as well. And it does search an insect monster with 1500 or less attack when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, but there is no maxi in the TCG, and unless you're playing Beat Trooper, nobody cares. Like, you could search Contact C, but I wouldn't even bother because it's not even that good. Again, Retaliating C is a fantastic side deck option, but I just wouldn't main deck it. Anyways, number 3 is Imperm, the objectively better version of Valor. It is by far the safest hand trap to play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it doesn't turn on Triple Tactic Talents or Call by the Grave, and you can even draw it for turn and it's still really good. And being able to negate spells and traps when you set it in the same column can be really nice because it can be your ticket out of playing through Rivalry or Goes and Match. So you see, with a card like Imperm, you might not even have to play back row removal in your main deck. And even though this card does not have the same power level of a card like Gamma, at least it's really versatile. I have to give Imperm a solid 9 out of 10, and I definitely recommend everybody to consider main decking 3 copies of this card. It's really that good. Alright, number 2 is kind of like the opposite of Imperm because this time it's kind of like a high risk, high reward hand trap in a way. I am talking about Drool and Logbird, which is a super aggressive, high-impact hand trap when it resolves, and when it works especially. Drool can be awkward when your opponent can have like quick play spell cards that search or special summon monsters that search on the draw phase, like again Southman Great Circle, Branded Opening, and the purely quick play spells in general. And even though Drool is usually really good against the Chimera deck, it's kinda bad if they physically open Mirror Swords Knight. Like, it'll only shut down the Gazelle search effect, but that's kind of irrelevant at that point. If you use Drool here, you lose a card, and then the Chimera Fusion makes you lose another card, and your opponent still has 3 interruptions at the very least, off of one single card. Yeah, that's kind of problematic. But apart from that, Drool can pretty much trap every deck in general, depending on the timing. I still consider it a risky card because it doesn't really make your opponent lose anything by default. But it does make your opponent lose tempo, and in the current game that we live in, losing tempo pretty much translates to losing advantage. And this is the kind of hand trap that can theoretically make your opponent insta-pass turn doing nothing. And we take that. Just be conscious that it doesn't do anything sometimes against a few decks. Like, this card is absolute crap against trap decks and Unchained, for example. And if you're going first post game 1, Drool is not really good. Because the game plan going second is completely different than going first, so your opponent might not even have to search that much. Anyways, the best hand trap in the current format is obviously Ash. It's only truly high impact against a handful of decks like the branded based strategies, but overall it's really applicable. So again, it's usually average against most decks, but sometimes it's extremely good. For example, sometimes ashing the Kashtira field spell might just be like an insta-pass turn for them. Maybe they hard drew like Theosis and Birth and they only need like a monster in order to play, but they only have green cards. And Ash is one of the only hand traps, including Ghostbel, that is actually good against trap decks. Because again, everybody and their mother needs to interact with a deck in order to play. So if you had to play 9 hand traps, hypothetically, I would consider main decking 3 Drool, 3 Imperm, and 3 Ash. And if you could afford 3 more, I would add 3 Valor. And then the last ones that you could consider would be Ghost Mourner. And then for the side deck, maybe Retaliating C, Ghostbel, Bestials, DD Crow, and Nibiru potentially. But Retaliating C has to be the best side deck hand trap, at least in my opinion. With that said, that's pretty much all I had for this video, so guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts about the best hand traps in the current format in the comment section below. And I'll see you guys very soon. Peace.